Evelyn Carter had seen war, had breathed its acrid smoke, and tasted its bitter cost. She had taken lives from distances where her targets never even felt fear before they died. But those days were behind her, at least they were supposed to be. Now, she lived in relative peace on Haven 3, a human colony on the fringes of known space, awaiting the birth of her first child. The war between Earth and the Galactic Empire had never touched this quiet corner of the universe. Until now. The Empire's fleet arrived like a storm, descending with the arrogance of conquerors who saw no real opposition before them. They had subjugated countless worlds, dismantling resistance with overwhelming force, and they believed this would be no different. When the first ships broke through the atmosphere, Evelyn already knew what was coming. She watched from a colony's observation dome as dark metallic vessels cast shadows over the cityscape. She felt the weight of her unborn child shift inside her, a reminder that she was no longer just a soldier. She was a mother. The Empire did not waste time with negotiations. Their troops landed in rigid formation, armored figures marching down the streets, their voices distorted through amplifiers as they announced their control. The governor was executed in the square, his body left as a warning. Anyone in a uniform was rounded up immediately, human defenses crushed under the sheer might of imperial precision. Evelyn, along with the other civilians, was herded toward the center of town, their fates left uncertain. A high-ranking officer, his polished exosuit gleaming under Haven 3's artificial sun, scanned the assembled humans with the disinterest of a predator inspecting its caged prey. His name was Commander Velker, a veteran of planetary conquests. His gaze passed over engineers, merchants, farmers, until it landed on Evelyn. She did not look like a soldier anymore. Dressed in civilian clothes, her long hair tied back in an unassuming braid, the swell of her pregnancy unmistakable. Yet something in her eyes held his attention. He stepped forward, tilting his head. "And what are you supposed to be?" His voice, though translated through his suit, carried amusement. A warrior carrying her replacement. Laughter rippled through the gathered troops, a cruel, mechanical sound. Evelyn remained silent, her expression unreadable. Velker circled her, as if struggling to understand why he sensed something different about this woman. "I find it amusing," he continued, turning to address his soldiers, "that these humans boast of their warriors, their resilience, yet here we have one so fragile, burdened by the very thing that makes her weak." His eyes met hers again, calculating. "Tell me, were you a soldier?" Evelyn did not flinch. "Once." More laughter, this time from both Imperials and some of the gathered colonists, eager to stay on the good side of their new rulers. Velker smirked. "Well, you are of no use now," he said dismissively. "A relic of a dying species, unfit for anything but submission." He turned to his subordinates. "Take her with the others, but do not waste time monitoring her. A woman in her condition is no threat to the Empire." The soldiers shoved Evelyn forward, directing her into one of the holding facilities that had once been the colony's trade hub. The inside was packed with captured personnel, pilots, security officers, anyone suspected of being a threat. Among them were women who, like Evelyn, had once worn Earth's uniform. Some still carried the hardness of soldiers, others had resigned themselves to whatever fate awaited them. A younger woman, Corporal Dana Ruiz, leaned against the wall, watching as Evelyn was pushed inside. "Didn't think they'd bother rounding up civilians," she muttered. Evelyn exhaled, lowering herself carefully onto a crate. "They don't see me as a threat." Ruiz smirked. "They're blind, then." Evelyn glanced around the room. The Imperials had underestimated them. That was their first mistake. The second would come soon enough. Outside, Velker continued his parade of arrogance, broadcasting messages of the Empire's victory across Haven 3's communication networks. He spoke of humanity's weakness, of their inevitable assimilation into the Empire. A segment of his broadcast focused entirely on Evelyn, mocking her as the perfect symbol of Earth's failure. A former soldier, now helpless, reduced to nothing more than a burden. The footage played across the colony, reaching even those still in hiding. But those who truly knew war understood something the Empire did not. Underestimation was the first step toward defeat. Evelyn closed her eyes, feeling the steady rhythm of her child's movements. She was not helpless. She was not beaten. The Empire thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. The first kill came at dusk. A single Imperial officer, standing atop the observation tower near the colony's main square, his posture relaxed, helmet off. He had no reason to be cautious. Haven 3 was under complete control. The resistance had been crushed before it could form, and those who might have fought were either imprisoned or too afraid to act. The humans were broken. That was the assumption. The shot was precise, the energy round silent as it lanced through the officer's skull. He was dead before his body hit the floor, a limp marionette whose strings had been cut. The sentries below barely noticed until the shift change, and by then, the weapon used was already hidden, the sniper already back among the prisoners, unnoticed. Evelyn wiped the sweat from her brow, exhaling slowly. The rifle, stolen from an inattentive guard, was alien in design, its scope too clumsy, its balance unfamiliar. It had taken time to adjust, to strip away its excess functions, to make it behave like the weapons she had trained with on Earth. Imperial rifles were designed for overwhelming force, for rapid suppression. She needed precision. The guards reacted as expected, poorly. The Empire had fought many wars, but it had never battled ghosts. They combed the area, interrogated civilians, executed 3 men at random to set an example. Fear worked in their favor, but fear without direction was dangerous. Evelyn watched from her cell as Velker barked orders, his frustration evident. The death of one officer was insignificant. The fact that they had no explanation for it was not. By the time the second kill happened, the Imperials were already on edge. A patrol, 3 soldiers moving along a deserted street, helmets scanning for movement. They were cautious, but not cautious enough. The shot struck the lead soldier's visor, shattering it, killing him instantly. His companions fired blindly in response, plasma round scorching walls, setting off alarms, alerting every sentry in the sector. It didn't matter. By the time they organized, Evelyn was back among the prisoners, her weapons safely hidden beneath the loose metal grating in the floor. The others were watching now. The women who had once worn uniforms, who had once fought, who had once believed they were defeated. They had seen the broadcasts, heard the mockery. They had also seen the growing fear in their captors. Evelyn did not have to say anything. The third kill came 2 days later. This time it was different. She left the body in the open, a deliberate statement. She wanted them to know they were being hunted. Velker's response was immediate. He locked down the colony, restricted movement, doubled patrols. He still did not understand what he was dealing with. Evelyn adjusted her grip, forcing her hands steady as she cleaned the rifle. The tension in her lower back was worsening. Her body was exhausted, carrying both the weight of her child and the weight of what was to come. She had fought through worse. She would fight through this. Dana Ruiz crouched beside her, watching in silence. The young corporal had been the first to catch on, the first to understand what was happening. She had not asked questions. She had simply offered to help. "They're scared," Ruiz murmured. "They don't know where to look." "They will soon." Evelyn checked the rifle's charge. 1 shot left. She would have to make it count. The resistance was building itself from nothing, from whispers in the dark, from stolen moments when the guards were distracted. It was a war of adaptation, of making use of what little they had. Weapons were scarce, but knowledge was not. They rewired broken comms units, repurposed discarded tech, mapped patrol routes based on nothing more than observation and memory. The Imperials controlled everything, but they did not understand what they controlled. That was their weakness. They saw only statistics, projections, probabilities. They had never fought against something they could not predict. Another shot. Another body. Velker stood in the square that evening, his face unreadable as he addressed the gathered prisoners. Behind him, the latest victim was displayed, slumped against the colony's flagpole, armor stained with cooling blood. The message was clear. "This ends now," Velker said, his voice sharp, measured. "You are mistaken if you believe you can resist the Empire. We are inevitable. You are statistics. Variables that will be corrected." Silence. The prisoners said nothing. The civilians said nothing. But the soldiers among them, the women who had fought before, who had survived before, recognized something in Velker's tone. The doubt. The realization that this was no longer a simple occupation. Evelyn met his gaze from a crowd. He did not know it was her. He would soon. The game was just beginning. Velker was losing control. The reports were damning. More soldiers missing from their posts, found dead in alleyways or slumped over in their barracks, their weapons untouched. It wasn't a riot, wasn't a full-scale rebellion. Those could be crushed with overwhelming force. This was something else. Something precise. Calculated. An infection spreading through the cracks of the Empire's occupation, one kill at a time. The curfews became absolute. No civilian was allowed outside past sundown. Anyone caught near an Imperial post was executed on sight. Surveillance drones filled the air, scanning for heat signatures, tracking movement through walls. Even the patrols no longer walked alone. They traveled in groups, weapons at the ready, helmets sealed. Evelyn watched from the shadows, unseen, untraceable. The pressure in her lower spine was relentless, the weight of her unborn child pressing down with every movement. It slowed her, forced her to adjust, but it did not stop her. She had adapted before. She was adapting now. Ruiz moved beside her, barely a whisper in the dark. The younger woman had proven herself quickly, a fast learner with sharp instincts. She had no sniper training, but she didn't need it. The others were beginning to follow her lead, not just surviving but fighting back in small ways, sabotaging supply caches, jamming communication relays, turning the colony into something unpredictable. Evelyn had seen this kind of war before. The Empire had not. Velker paced inside the command center, his hands clenched behind his back as he listened to his officers explain their failures. He did not tolerate failure. That was the core of his reputation. And yet, the bodies continued to pile up, and he still had no enemy to face. "She's here," he muttered mostly to himself. General Rask, his second in command, shifted uncomfortably. "The civilians are terrified. They won't resist openly." "They don't have to," Velker snapped. He gestured toward the latest report. "One woman. One damn woman. That's all it takes, apparently, to make fools of the Empire." His officers stiffened at the words. They had all heard the rumors. The sniper. The ghost. A nameless specter in the dark, moving between shadows, striking without warning. Some dismissed it as human desperation, a colony clinging to legends. Others were not so sure. Velker wasn't sure either, and that infuriated him. Outside the command center, the city was changing. The prisoners had begun to whisper, their fear shifting into something else. Hope. Not blind, foolish hope, but something sharper, something dangerous. The Imperials could sense it. The tension was thick enough to suffocate. Evelyn crouched low against the side of a transport vehicle, her rifle nestled against her shoulder. The alien weapon was heavier than she liked, slower than she preferred, but it did its job. Velker had left himself vulnerable, standing just beyond the shielded perimeter of the command center, speaking to his officers without his helmet. She could take the shot. End this now. But she didn't. Because Velker was not the problem. The Empire was. And a single kill, no matter how satisfying, would not be enough. Instead, she adjusted her aim, shifted her target. The communications officer beside him. The one relaying orders, coordinating security. The shot was nearly silent. The officer collapsed before anyone understood what had happened. Panic followed. Weapons were drawn, orders were shouted, drones took to the sky, scanning for a shooter. But Evelyn was already gone, slipping between blind spots, moving before they could react. Ruiz was waiting when she reached the tunnels beneath the colony, her breath tight with adrenaline. That was a message. Evelyn nodded. They needed to hear it. Velker heard it, loud and clear. By morning, the executions began. Prisoners dragged into the square, lined up against the walls, gunned down in full view of the colony. Men, women, no distinction. Velker wanted fear. He wanted obedience. But he had already lost. Because fear was a tool with a double edge. And he had just given Evelyn everything she needed. The city was ready. The war had truly begun. The first explosion tore through the Imperial barracks before dawn. The second ignited a munitions depot, sending a plume of fire and shrapnel into sky, shaking the ground beneath Haven 3. The Empire had expected assassinations, ambushes in the dark. They had not expected an all-out assault. Evelyn moved through the crumbling infrastructure, her rifle steady, breath controlled despite the sharp pain in her lower back. The baby was coming soon. She could feel it. But not yet. Not now. The city had become a battlefield, and she had work to finish. Velker staggered out of the command center, his uniform streaked with dust and blood. His officers shouted conflicting reports, struggling to make sense of the chaos unraveling around them. This isn't possible. Rask snarled. They have no ships. No support. How are they? They've had time, Velker muttered. His voice was eerily calm. We gave them time. That had been his mistake. He had assumed this was still an occupation, that he was still in control. The truth was far worse. The prisoners had never been prisoners. They had been waiting, learning, studying every weakness. And now they were striking with precision. The drones were useless, their signal feeds jammed. The automated defenses had been disabled before they could lock onto anything. The Imperials had never considered that their own technology could be turned against them. A sniper round clipped Velker's shoulder. He spun, barely managing to stay on his feet, his eyes scanning the rooftops, the shattered windows, the smog-filled air. He couldn't see her, but he knew. Evelyn chambered another round, adjusting her position. She had let him live before. That mercy had served its purpose. It had allowed the resistance to grow, to build itself into something undeniable. But now he had no more use. Another explosion rocked the colony, a final detonation at the power grid, plunging the sector into flickering darkness. The perfect cover. Velker turned too late. The bullet tore through his chest, his body slamming against the side of a transport vehicle. He gasped, fingers clutching at his armor, as if trying to hold himself together. His knees buckled. He collapsed. The war wasn't over. Not yet. But the symbol of its oppression had just fallen. The last thing Velker saw before his vision blurred was a figure stepping out of the smoke, a rifle slung across her back, her stance unwavering despite the weight she carried. A woman, a soldier, a mother. The Empire had mocked her, underestimated her. They would never make that mistake again.